Welcome back to BLOCKTV. It's time for cryptonomics and a closer look today at traditional markets, world leaders' meetings, and of course tweets that can upend them all. Now, on Monday, this Monday morning, pre the U.S. markets opening, Asia is already showing reaction signs to the escalated rhetoric of the China-U.S. trade war this past weekend. Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index was down 3% overnight, leading into the start of the business week. And Shanghai's Composite Index as well fell by 1.4%, leading to losses across Asia. Important to note, we're taping this before the Western markets open. Now, the Asian sell-off reflects how worried investors are about tariff hikes from both the United States and China, and whether the latest chapter in this dispute could fuel a severe global economic showdown. Meanwhile, back in France, where the G7 summit is entering its last day today, mixed messages by the President of the United States have done little to calm the markets.
Has the President any second thoughts on escalating the trade war with China?
Yeah, for sure. Why not?
Second thoughts?
Might as well. Might as well.
Do you have second thoughts about escalating the war with
I
China?
have second thoughts about everything.
Joining me in studio, senior correspondent Asher Westrup Evans. He doesn't have second thoughts on everything.
A few things.
A few things, but they maybe aren't that detrimental to world economy.
No, certainly not.
So, first of all, let's start with, we are taping this, as we said, Monday morning, though, U.S. markets yet to open. Reactions, though, in Asia.
Exactly. As you said in your intro there have been steep falls throughout Asian markets. We've seen that across the board. Obviously, they didn't get that chance to react on Friday after Trump's initial statements having already closed for the day. So this is their first chance of reaction. We've seen not looking good so far. It's been a dire situation there, and it's interestingly correlated, and we'll touch on this more, with a bit of a bump we've seen in crypto markets this morning. Tape it off a little bit, but still that interesting little bump, we're seeing that correlative effect at play. Interesting to see.
No, which is interesting to see, and wondering to see how they will react after the U.S., the American markets open. But exactly, you know, the G7 is happening at such a defining time right now, given the real the very heated rhetoric that we're hearing from both the President of the United States and the reactions from China. What is going on there? Has the President of the United States achieved anything other than just claiming that he's ready to change his mind?
Yeah, look, it doesn't seem like he's convinced other leaders at the G7 of much, whether that be to take on board his trade war messages or to admit Russia back to the table as he'd wanted in the past. None of these things have taken place in any big major shift. In fact, we've seen a lot of disunity despite, of course, French President Emmanuel Macron's best efforts to gather unity, to galvanize the G7 to a sort of cohesive message. He tried multiple times over the weekend to try and get this and take quite a strong leadership position, yet hasn't quite
And it's
achieved
interesting
that.
when you say that, because Macron seems to be there in the midst also of trying to bring back the EU to the table with the newly elected British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And in that respect, almost trying to take the role of the leading financial...
Exactly, yeah. Really taking, with Merkel stepping back now in her last term, set in a sort of caretaker mode, as it were, Macron really stepping up to try and make some strong plays there. And it's interesting to see, though, because despite his efforts, the narrative can still be subverted so quickly. We had, for example, Trump this morning stating that the US and China are, he said, getting back to the table regarding negotiations. Now, this is set, as we said, the US markets haven't opened yet, but pre-market, the Dow is already up 200 points off the back of these statements alone. I mean, the fact that Trump can just make one statement and another and the market shift so dramatically, it's a sign on the one hand of enormous power, but on the other, perhaps a bit of instability in the markets themselves, that they're able to be swung so wildly by just a quick statement.
Tweet.
Yeah. On a man who, as he said, self-professed, has second thoughts on everything.
Second thoughts on everything. I want to go back to the correlation in a minute, but because the trade war is so prevalent in any financial story nowadays, it's a perfect time to go straight to Beijing, where we are joined now live by Flex Young, CEO of Babel Finance, joining us live from Beijing. I want to thank you so much for being with us, because the other side of the story clearly is where you're sitting. Asher, first question to Flex.
Flex, thanks so much for joining us. I just want to start by asking you, so we have seen that fall in the Asian markets today. It's something that sort of we saw earlier on in the day. Are investors scared in Asia? Is your sense that there is a fear in investors in Asia? And do you think that generally, whether Bitcoin or not, do you think that they're turning to safe haven assets?
Right. China announced last Friday to impose 5 to 10% tariff on extra 75 billion goods importing from the US. And of course, Mr. Trump reacted to China's decision by tweeting, further increase the tariff on Chinese goods as well. As you mentioned just now, that current market emotion has been drifted by Trump's tweets for a lot. And we found out this morning that investors in China, in Asia, they are so scared, and we can see Chinese market close very low today. And it's very, very true that the investors are buying safe haven assets this morning. We see that lots of investors push the gold price to actually highest level in 6 years. So yeah, right. People are getting into the safe haven.
That's a pretty clear sign if you say that gold correlation. But I suppose let's turn to Bitcoin now. I mean, we've seen a jump this morning of a few percentage points of Bitcoin against the US dollar and other markets. Do you think that directly correlates to Asian investors' fears? Do you think that they're turning to Bitcoin as that safe haven and that narrative is playing out? Or do you think the two are unrelated?
Actually, we see the correlation between gold and the Bitcoin since May, since China trade war. And yes, people could see that this morning, very, very clear correlation between gold price and the Bitcoin price happened. And after gold jumping to the highest level since 6 years, Bitcoin has actually dramatically reversed the position from actually 9,000 something to 10,300. So very, very fast rising this morning. So I think they are quite correlated. And although that gold is actually the key safe haven assets, but people are looking at Bitcoin as some sorts of alternative to gold as well. But we know that these are challenges for the traditional investors to actually participate in the Bitcoin market. So we see a little bit drag of the Bitcoin compared to gold itself.
It's fascinating to see that correlation, which, as again, we're theorizing, but as you said, Flex, I tend to be with you in that there is that correlation there. Now, not just looking long term, at the end of last week, the President of the United States had many tweets, one of them even almost asking, which he cannot really, he can't really decree, American companies to pull out of doing business with China. What was the reaction to that in the Chinese street, so to speak?
Actually, people in China are not very scared of these kinds of tweets since the Huawei event. Because after Mr. Trump wanted to shut Huawei's business in US, but finally Huawei still exists in US market. We see this is only something that Trump's tweets. And yes, we are approaching to the second term election. So we see lots of we could see that very weird tweets from Trump. But yes, you could understand that Chinese market is not very concerning about Trump's tweets as we are approaching the election.
Approaching elections, though, September 1st seems to be a very defining date when it comes to the U.S. and China, both sides threatening those tariffs. What is your feeling, worst case scenario, what will China suffer from a prolonged trade war?
Actually, I think China and the U.S. both suffer from the trade war, as we see the reaction from the lots of U.S. companies statements that they don't want to lose the Chinese market, and actually as the tariffs becoming higher, that Chinese consumer also buy higher price goods and higher price of the so-called equipments. So we see it actually suffers both countries. So both countries are suffered from the trade war. So we don't expect that people can go well with this trade war, but we really see this market is actually expecting China's dragging strategy. Like this morning, Mr. Liu also mentioned that China wants to renegotiate with the terms, and then Trump also tweets on these things. So we see this kind of political games.
Right.
So
They're political games, and as we said, the question is who really means their tweet, I think, is what we're all wondering, along with you. But indeed, everybody seems to be right now in this for the long haul. Flex, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Beijing today to take a look at the effects of that rhetoric with the trade war. Asher, finally to you. Clearly Flex in Beijing is seeing a correlation, people possibly viewing Bitcoin as gold, as a safe haven. Can we say that also around the world? Can we see that trend?
Look, I mean, it's played out in smaller microcosms in the past, whether we talk about particular countries with bad currency issues, we're talking Turkey, we're talking Russia, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, we've seen people turn to the safe haven. Is the narrative ingrained in the whole wider economy? I think it's too early to say. I think the test case hasn't really been put in play. For better or worse, we haven't had the sort of global scale recession or financial crisis that would require the use of these sort of safe haven assets at that level just yet. Exactly, yet. I mean, time will tell. But I think there could be a test case fast approaching, at least in the sense with a trade war like this, with all the uncertainty that goes around, even if a resolution is reached between the US and China, the level of uncertainty at the top levels, with the Trump administration's sort of approach to trade, I think will send people walking towards safe havens and wanting to make sure that they've got safe havens well in hand and prepared to know what to use should the crisis eventuate in some way, shape or form. And Bitcoin could certainly fulfill that narrative. Definitely
so. Asher Westrop-Evans, senior correspondent for BLOCKTV. This was Cryptonomics. We'll be right back.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.